For 3 years, Darren Kowalski packed the same lunch. Not because he forgot to buy groceries, not because he didn't have time, because his daughter needed new winter boots before the snow hit, and the hydro bill was already 2 weeks past due, and something had to give. And it was always the thing he needed for himself that gave first. He was 51 years old, and he ate a peanut butter sandwich on white bread every single day. Wrapped in the same reused plastic bag he'd been rinsing out and drying on the dish rack since his wife left. The bread was whatever was on sale at Freshco. Sometimes it was the no-name stuff that went stale by Wednesday. He ate it anyway. His daughter never knew. Darren worked the early shift at a pallet yard in Brantford, Ontario, 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, lifting, stacking, sorting, loading. His hands were rough in a way that never quite healed. Not fully, not even in summer. In winter, they cracked at the knuckles and bled a little if he forgot the barrier cream, which he usually did because the tube ran out in November, and he kept meaning to pick up a new one. He didn't. He drove a 2004 Civic with a heat shield that rattled for the last 20 minutes of every trip, and a rear driver's side window that wouldn't roll down anymore, which didn't matter much in February but made the summers in the car feel like sitting inside someone's mouth. None of this was the point of the story, but all of it was the story. Because Darren Kowalski was not a man who talked about what he was going through. He was the kind of man who just went through it, quietly, and came out the other side with fewer things than he started with and more lines around his eyes than anyone his age should have. His daughter's name was Caitlin. She was 22. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, though she didn't know about the second part yet. She was finishing her last semester at Wilfrid Laurier. Business admin, a program she'd gotten a partial scholarship for, but that still cost more than Darren liked to think about. She lived in a house share in Waterloo with 3 other students, and came home to Brantford on holidays and occasional Sundays when she felt guilty about not coming home more often. She didn't know about the peanut butter sandwiches. She didn't know about the winter her father had turned the heat down to 16 degrees and slept in a sweater so the bill wouldn't spike. She didn't know that the boots she'd gotten for Christmas 2 years ago, good ones, waterproof, the kind that actually lasted, had cost her father 3 months of brown bagging and skipping the Tim Hortons coffee he used to get every morning before his shift. She thought things were hard but manageable. Darren had worked very hard to make her think that. The thing about pride, real pride, the deep down kind, is that it doesn't feel like pride from the inside. It feels like protection. Darren had been protecting Caitlin since she was 6 years old, and her mother, Jeanette, had sat him down at the kitchen table and said she was leaving. Not leaving him for someone else, she was clear about that. She just couldn't do this anymore. The house that was too small, the town that was too quiet, the life that had turned out to be so much smaller than the one she'd imagined for herself. She cried when she said it. Darren didn't. He waited until she was gone and Caitlin was asleep upstairs, and then he sat in the same chair for a long time without turning a light on. He never talked about that night, not to anyone. He enrolled Caitlin in swimming lessons the following spring because she'd been asking about them for 2 years, and Jeanette had kept saying they'd get to it. He started packing her lunches because the school had a nut-free policy and he didn't trust himself to remember every morning, so he made them the night before and put them in the fridge with a sticky note on the front. A little drawing usually, because she liked that. A cat, a star, a lopsided heart. He learned how to do her hair. That took longer than anything else. He watched YouTube videos in the dark after she went to bed, practicing on a rubber band and his own forearm, which was not remotely the same thing. He got better. He got good enough. That was what he did. He got good enough, and then he kept going. The years passed the way years do when you are too tired to count them carefully. Caitlin grew. She got opinions and a sense of humor, and a best friend named Abby who practically lived at their house. She got into Laurier on a partial scholarship, and Darren drove her there on move-in day, with her whole life packed into the back of the Civic, and a lump in his throat he swallowed somewhere around Cambridge. She cried a little when he left. He drove home and then sat in the parking lot of the Metro on King Street for 20 minutes before he could make himself go inside. He bought peanut butter that day, the big jar, store brand. It was Darren's coworker who first noticed. His name was Frank Belaski, 54, divorced, the kind of man who kept a full stock of opinions and wasn't shy about sharing them during the 15-minute break. He and Darren had worked the same shift for 6 years. They were not close in the way that required phone calls, but they were close in the way that required honesty. Frank noticed the lunches sometime in Darren's second year of making them. Or rather, he noticed what was missing from them. "You're eating that again," Frank said one Tuesday in March, watching Darren unwrap the sandwich over a folding table in the break room. "It's good," Darren said. "It's the same thing you had yesterday, and the day before that." Darren took a bite. "It's efficient." Frank looked at him for a moment. He didn't say anything right away, which was unusual for Frank. "How's Caitlin doing?" "Good, she's good. Got a part-time job at a cafe near campus. Good for her." Frank opened his thermos. "You ever think about applying for that supervisor position? Posted again last week. I saw it. More money, more headaches." Frank let it go. But Darren caught him looking at the sandwich one more time before break was over. A month later, in April, Darren came in to find a $20 Sobeys gift card sitting on top of his jacket in his locker. No note, no name. He stood there looking at it for a while. He knew it was Frank. He put it in his pocket and didn't say anything about it. The next morning, he brought 2 peanut butter sandwiches and left one on top of Frank's thermos without a word. Frank didn't say anything about that either. That was as close as Darren ever got to accepting help. The offer that really tested him came in November, in the 3rd year. Caitlin mentioned, casually, the way she mentioned things she didn't want to seem like a big deal, that her program was offering a placement trip to a conference in Toronto. 2 days, hotel included, a genuine networking opportunity. The only cost was the registration fee and food, $340. "I'm probably not going to go," she said over the phone. "It's kind of optional anyway." "Go," Darren said immediately. "Dad, Caitlin, go to the conference." Silence on her end. Then, "You sure? I'll send you the money Friday." He had $112 in his checking account on that Friday. He transferred $80 to Caitlin and then sat at the kitchen table with the hydro bill and a pen and did math that didn't add up no matter how many times he did it. There was a man at his church, not a close friend, just a man he knew, the kind of acquaintance built from years of nodding at each other across the parking lot. His name was Terrence Obie, and he'd recently retired from 25 years at the steel plant in Hamilton. He was comfortable. He was generous. He'd mentioned to Darren twice, that if Darren ever needed anything he should say so. Darren never said so. He sold his guitar instead. He'd had it for 23 years. He'd bought it the same summer he and Jeanette got together at a pawn shop in Hamilton, and he'd never gotten good enough at it to play in front of anyone, but he played it alone, sometimes, at night, sitting on the edge of his bed. Jeanette used to tease him about it. He kept it after she left. He listed it on Facebook Marketplace on a Sunday afternoon, and someone drove over from Hamilton on Tuesday and gave him $220 for it without negotiating. Darren stood in the hallway after the man left and looked at the empty space on the wall, where the guitar had hung for 6 years, and then he went back to the kitchen and paid the hydro bill. He didn't mention the guitar to Caitlin. He didn't mention it to Frank either. Frank would have done something about it. Darren didn't want anything done about it. That was the thing no one fully understood about him. It wasn't that he was too proud to ask. It was that asking, to him, felt like admitting that he hadn't been enough, that all the years of showing up and getting good enough and keeping going hadn't actually added up to something solid. He couldn't make himself do it. He couldn't look at Caitlin and let her see the math, so he didn't. Caitlin came home the 3rd weekend in February. She called from the road to say she'd be there around 4. Darren made chili. The good kind, from scratch, with dried beans he'd soaked overnight, and fresh cornbread because she liked it, and he set the small table properly, with actual napkins, not paper towel. She came through the door with her backpack and a canvas tote bag and snow on her shoulders, and she looked at the table and said, "Dad, you didn't have to do all this." "Sit down," he said. "You're letting cold air in." They ate together. She talked about her thesis project and her roommates, and a professor she couldn't stand, who gave feedback like he was personally offended by effort. Darren listened. He was good at listening. He'd gotten very good at it over the years because it was the one thing he could always give that didn't cost money. After dinner, she washed the dishes without being asked. She always did that now, he noticed, and it made him quietly proud. And then she sat back down at the table with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She said, "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Sure." She looked at him in a way that was careful, measured, the way she looked when she'd been thinking about something for a while and had decided to go ahead anyway. "Did you sell your guitar?" The kitchen was very quiet. Darren looked at his coffee mug. "Where'd you hear that?" "Abby's cousin lives in Hamilton. He bought a guitar on Marketplace a few months ago." She paused. "He recognized your name." Darren nodded slowly. He didn't say anything. "Dad." Her voice was steady, but something in it was working hard to stay that way. "How long has it been like this, Saitlin? How long?" He looked at her. There was no version of this where the math didn't eventually show. "A while," he said. She set her mug down carefully. "Why didn't you tell me? Because you were in school?" "That's not a reason. It's the only reason I needed." She was quiet for a moment. Her jaw moved slightly, the way it did when she was trying to decide between two things she wanted to say. "I could have worked more hours at the cafe," she said finally. "I could have applied for more bursaries. I could have taken one less course and graduated a semester later. There were options, Dad. There were options you didn't give me a chance to." "You didn't need those options," he said. "You needed to finish school. I needed you to not sell your guitar. That's different." "It's not different." She pressed her hands flat on the table. Her voice cracked a little on the next sentence, and she let it. "I've been sitting here for 4 months, thinking things were hard but okay. And you've been sitting here selling things you love and eating." "What, Dad?" "What have you been eating?" He looked at his coffee. "Peanut butter sandwiches," she said. Her voice dropped. Not a question. He didn't answer. Which was an answer. Caitlin sat back in her chair. She looked at the ceiling. She pressed her lips together and blinked a few times, and then she looked back at him and said, "Do you know how that makes me feel? I didn't want you to worry." "That's not love, Dad. That's you deciding for me what I could handle." She shook her head. "I'm 22. I'm not 6 anymore. You can tell me things." Darren looked at his daughter, who had her mother's eyes and his stubbornness, and somewhere along the way had also grown a kind of directness that was entirely her own, and for the first time in a long time he felt the full weight of what being alone with something costs you, not the money, the other thing. "I know," he said, quietly. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Her hands were small. They had always been small. He remembered when they fit entirely inside one of his. "You have to let people in," she said. "Not just me. People. Terrence. Frank. Whoever. You have to let someone help sometimes. I'm not good at that. I know." She squeezed his hand. "You're going to have to get better at it. There's a specific kind of silence that comes after a hard conversation. Not the empty kind, but the settled kind. The kind that means something got said that needed saying. And now the air is different." That was the silence in Darren Kowalski's kitchen on a February evening in Brantford, Ontario. With snow coming down outside, and the chili pot still on the stove, and 2 people sitting at a small table with their hands in between them. Caitlin stayed the whole weekend. She did not immediately fix everything. She was 22 and a student, and there were limits to what she could fix. But she called the university's bursary office on Saturday morning and found out there were 3 emergency funds he'd been eligible for that he'd never applied to. She spent 2 hours on the phone and the computer while Darren watched from the doorway of the living room with his coffee and said nothing. On Sunday morning, she made breakfast. eggs, toast, the good coffee she'd brought from Waterloo. And they sat together and she told him about the conference in Toronto, how she'd met a woman there from a logistics firm in Hamilton who'd offered her an interview, how it had led to something she hadn't told him about yet because she wanted to be sure first. She'd been offered a job, full-time, starting in June. In Hamilton, 20 minutes from Brantford. Darren looked at her across the breakfast table. "You've known for 2 weeks," he said. "I wanted to make sure it was real first." He nodded. He looked at his eggs. "Hamilton," he said. "Hamilton." She watched him carefully, 20 minutes. He nodded again. He wasn't going to cry at the breakfast table. He was not going to do that. He didn't. But when she left Sunday afternoon and he stood on the porch watching the taillights of her car go down the street, something in him released. Some particular tension he'd been holding. For so long he'd stopped knowing it was there, and he stood there in his work coat in the cold for a long time after she was gone. He called Terence Obie the following Tuesday. It took him 3 days to work up to it, and he made himself dial before he could talk himself out of it. Terence answered on the second ring. When Darren explained where things stood, the heating, the lunches, the guitar, the math, Terence didn't say much. He listened the way Darren listened, all the way through. Then he said, "I'm glad you called." Just that. He didn't make it bigger. He didn't offer a lecture or a loan. He invited Darren over for dinner on Thursday and let it be simple. Darren went. He sat at Terence's kitchen table and ate a home-cooked meal that someone else had made, and he talked, really talked. Not the edited version, not the version with the hard parts taken out, and by the time he got in the Civic to drive home, he felt lighter than he had in 3 years. Maybe more. Frank found out eventually. He always found out eventually. He didn't say anything for a day or two, and then he showed up on break with 2 coffee cups from Tim Hortons and set one in front of Darren without comment. "You didn't have to." Darren started. "It's 1 coffee," Frank said. "Sit down." Darren sat down. He drank the coffee. It was good. It was a medium dark roast with 1 sugar, which was exactly how he'd been ordering it before the budget started biting, and Frank had apparently just remembered that without being asked. "Thanks," Darren said. "Don't mention it," Frank said, and meant it literally. Caitlin graduated in April. Convocation was in the afternoon at the athletic complex on campus, which smelled like floor wax and industrial carpet, and 400 families wearing their good clothes. Darren wore the gray blazer he'd had since his cousin's wedding in 2014 and had dry cleaned for the occasion. He sat in the 3rd row from the back because that was where the seats still were when it arrived. He watched her cross the stage. She shook hands with someone in academic robes and accepted a tube that contained her diploma and looked out at the crowd and found him. Somehow, in that full room, she found him, and she smiled. Darren clapped until his hands hurt. After, in the hallway, she came through the crowd and hugged him, still in her gown, the mortarboard slightly crooked. She smelled like the good perfume she only wore for special occasions. "You came," she said, which was a joke, because of course he came. He would have walked to Waterloo if the Civic had given out. "Nice hat," he said. She laughed. The sound of it hit him somewhere in the chest. They went to a restaurant that evening. A real one, with cloth napkins and a menu that had more than 1 page, because Caitlin had made the reservation without telling him, and when he looked at the prices, she put her hand over the menu and said, "My treat." Caitlin. Dad. He let her. They ordered things he hadn't ordered in years. He had the steak. It was the best thing he'd eaten in as long as he could reliably remember, and not only because of what it was. Halfway through the meal, she reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope and set it on the table between them. He looked at it. "What's this?" "Open it." He opened it. Inside was a card. Simple, white, with a blue border. On the front it said, "For Dad." Inside, in her handwriting, it said, "You gave me everything. Now it's my turn." 6 words. 5 if you counted it the way she'd meant it. Darren sat with the card in both hands. The restaurant was full of noise and silverware and other people's conversations, and none of it came through. "Caitlin," he said. "Don't argue," she said. Her eyes were bright. She was holding herself very steady, the way she did when she was feeling more than she wanted to show. The thing she'd gotten from him, the thing he'd passed on without knowing it. Just say okay. He looked at his daughter. He looked at the card. He had spent 22 years protecting her from the math, from the hard sums, the numbers that didn't work out, the guitar on the wall, and the sandwiches, and the nights he sat at the kitchen table alone, with a pen and a bill and not enough column space. He had given her everything she needed to get here. She had gotten here, and now she was sitting across from him in a restaurant with cloth napkins, holding herself together the same way he always held himself together, asking him to just say okay. He cleared his throat. Okay, he said. She smiled. Her mother's eyes, his stubbornness, and something else, something she'd grown herself, looking back at him across the table. Good, she said, and picked up her fork. Outside, the April snow was coming down the way it does in southern Ontario, soft and unconvinced, not quite winter and not quite done with it. The kind of snow that doesn't stick. The kind that falls anyway, because that's what it does, and is gone by morning without leaving a mark. Darren Kowalski drove home that night with his blazer folded on the passenger seat and the card in his chest pocket, and the heat worked fine the whole way. And for the first time in 3 years, he didn't stop to do the math before he fell asleep.